very different. Recording in progress. That's okay. Anyways, 3 very different priority populations that were identified by the ELD as folks that we wanted to hear from in particular this year. So we talked with families with infants and toddlers. We'll tell a little bit more about that. With LGBTQIA plus families with young children and families whose children were asked to leave childcare or suspended or expelled from childcare. So I wanted just to also to let you know that today we're going to give you an overview of things that were similar across all of those groups, as well as some differences that popped up. And we also will be sharing an opportunity after, at the end of this meeting, we're going to be doing some more in-depth presentations that really go into more detail about each of the findings from the 3 different priority populations, because I think each one was quite unique and shared really deep, interesting information with us. And we learned a lot from hearing their very different stories and perspectives around trying to access and use quality childcare in the state of Oregon. Okay, so just a shout out to our very large PDG research team and our partners. We did a lot of this work with our great collaborators at AV Cultural Drivers, Neldo Reyes and Sergio Omar, as well as with our partners at OSLC Developments, Catherine Pears and her team. So just couldn't have done this without a very large and diverse group of researchers. We also couldn't have done it without our community organizational partners. We worked with the infant and toddler listening sessions, with the Black Parent Initiative, with Oregon Community Action, Eastern Oregon Early Learning Hub, Multnomah County Healthy Birth Initiative, and the Oregon Child Development Coalition to help us review and facilitate listening sessions with the families involved in their services, as well as with Pride Northwest on our LGBTQIA plus listening session. So huge shout out to our community partners. Okay, I think at this point I'm going to turn it over for Mackenzie. We're going to kind of tag team between the 2 of us so you don't get too tired of hearing any one voice for too long. So Mackenzie, take it away.
Yeah, so just a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So we already did some introductions. So lovely to have all of you here. So we'll share the purpose of the listening sessions that we did in the spring, kind of our approach and who we heard from, and then what are some of the key highlights we heard from families from those 3 different populations that we talked to, or 3 different focus groups that we did, and we'll have chance for discussion. We'll kind of play that by ear depending on how much time we have, either for some small group discussion or a large group, or something in the chat depending on kind of where we're at that point in time, and then next steps and what's coming in the future. So I know we already did some introductions in the chat, but wondering if folks wouldn't mind just raising their hand if they are part of the research team. Let's see who's. I think it might just be me, Beth, and Sandra, who helped to do some of those interviews and focus groups. And then what about ELD staff? If you could raise your hand, using the Zoom hand gestures or actual hand raise. And then hub staff, curious. Great. Thank you. And CCRR staff. Awesome. Anybody would fit into another category that we haven't mentioned yet? Great, thank you. So what we were hoping as part of these listening sessions was really to hear from families that we may not have heard from in previous data collection efforts through the Preschool Development Grant. As some of you may have remembered that we did a number of listening sessions in the first round of the strengths and needs assessment. And so we really wanted to prioritize some families that we hadn't had captured in that last round. And so that included families with infants and toddlers. Specifically, we were able to hear from families who identified as African American Black, lived in rural frontier areas, and Native American, Native Alaskan, and Latinx or Hispanic families who had infants and toddlers. And we were also able to speak with LGBTQIA plus families who have young children, I think specifically children that are younger than 5, and families whose children were asked to leave childcare, either being picked up early or, who had been asked to leave permanently their childcare arrangements. And so we did a number of interviews with those families. We really wanted to learn from families what quality, culturally relevant, appropriate care looks like for all of those families, and their experiences finding and using quality care, and then what needs to be changed to make that childcare more affordable, accessible, and high quality for each of those families.
Great. Thanks, Mackenzie. And I wanted to add too, if you have any questions or anything that comes up, any clarification, if you could put it in the chat. But I'm wondering if someone on the ELD side might be able to monitor the chat, because I think it's hard for us to monitor the chat if any questions come up. And if you do, great, thank you so much. All right, so how do we listen to families? We conducted the listening sessions in winter and spring of 2022. Altogether, we had 8 remote or Zoom family sessions with 2 in Spanish. We also, for our suspension expulsion, we interviewed over the phone or by Zoom 15 families. These were identified through last year's family household survey as families who had answered a question about whether their child had been asked to leave care or to take a break from care on the survey, and then we followed up to talk to them to learn more about what happened. 2 of those were in Spanish and 13 in English. Altogether, we talked to 81 families across all these listening sessions. And again, 3 reports were generated, 1 for each group, as well as the executive summary, which goes across all of them.
Beth, I just wanted to add also the process that we used. During the beginning of the presentation, we mentioned a number of community organizations that we engaged. And so we reached out to those community organizations and gave them a stipend to help us recruit and plan for, and gave feedback on interview questions, as well as some community organizations decided to co-facilitate those listening sessions. So just wanted to mention that also.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Yeah, that was really important, and it's been a process we've used before to really, I think we find it very effective in terms of more effectively engaging families with using a partnership with a community organization that's already built that trust. And also providing the reports back to them and giving them opportunities to contribute to the questions that we're asking, as well as to the final reports and the kind of interpretations and stories that we're hearing, to do some checking to make sure that those are reflecting what really they heard families sharing with us. So just a little bit more detail. I won't go to too much around exact participant characteristics, but just to show you, I think we did have a number of highly culturally and linguistically diverse families who participated in the infant and toddler listening sessions. So we had good representation, both in terms of racial and ethnic background, linguistic background, and geographic background, so across the state. In terms of our LGBTQIA plus families, again, we had, they were quite a culturally and linguistically diverse group, and also quite widely distributed across the state. So about half were in urban and about half were in rural communities. And then for the suspension expulsion interviews, again, quite a diverse group of families that we spoke to in both English and Spanish. And again, a pretty good distribution geographically across the state. Okay. So Mackenzie, do you want to start with sharing some of the findings we had around quality?
Yeah, so for each of the kind of type of listening sessions that we did, we created, with the help of our wonderful graphic designer, some of these visuals to capture, really what we heard from each of these groups that, might have been specific to that particular group in terms of what quality care looked like for them. So for families with infants and toddlers, some of these will not be new to folks in terms of, wanting care that's available when parents need it, is based on trust. It's culturally and linguistically specific and or responsive. So really, reflecting the culture and linguistic needs of the family in that setting, provides a healthy, safe, and developmentally stimulating environment, providing educational, developmental, and enrichment activities, having low staff-child ratios, well-trained providers, and providing families with additional support resources outside of the care that they're being provided. And for families whose children were asked to leave care, leave or take a break from care, what we heard is, really needing safe, inclusive, and supportive environments that are going to be accepting of their child and the needs that that child has, and individualized classroom structure, routines, and curriculums. So having flexibility for children who need, some different routines or have different needs when it comes to transitioning. Or, one thing we heard was one child didn't want to wear rain pants. And so the provider had an issue with the child not wearing rain pants. And so having flexibility in what that looks like in the classroom is really essential. And having a commitment for value and inclusion for all children. Almost, I think, actually all of the 15 families that we spoke with felt like their provider was discriminating against their child because of their either behavioral or medical needs. And really wanting that collaboration with families. So looking at having more techniques that families could be doing at home, or resources that they could be accessing to, help support their child's behavior, as well as, wanting to just feel more supported and, in a trusting relationship with their provider.
Oops, oh no, she's frozen.
Oh no, is that?
Yep, you're back. You're back.
Oh, okay. Not sure what happened there. So as well as providers who use developmentally appropriate and individualized approaches. So for example, we heard from one family that their 1-year-old was kicked out of a program for biting, which, as we know, that's very developmentally appropriate for a 1-year-old to do. And so needing, more training around those pieces, and information and access to other supports for families and children, like physical therapy or occupational therapy or speech therapy or, parent-child interaction therapy. So, in addition to all of those other things, having additional supports that families are able to access easily and affordably. And then for our LGBTQIA plus families, in addition to a lot of the things that we have heard previously, but some things that were specific to these families in terms of quality care, having safe spaces that respect diversity, inclusion, and LGBTQIA plus values, spaces that are free of gender-based dynamics or gender-specific communication, providers who are treating same-sex and or queer parents, caregivers equally without any bias or judgment, and providers who use an anti-bias and LGBTQIA plus curriculum with a focus on respecting diversity specifically, and then also some kind of intentional indicator that there is an open and welcome space for LGBTQIA plus families.
All right, so thank you, Mackenzie. So those were just really high level sort of depictions of the elements of quality that came out in our conversations with families and what they were looking for and hoping for. And all too often, I think, unfortunately, we're not able to find. And I do urge you when the reports are out to read the reports. We really try to highlight families' voices and let them speak for themselves. But it's some heartbreaking stuff. It really is. There's really there's some amazing strengths and resources and ingenuity in families and what they're going through. But there's a lot of stress and trauma and challenges that they're having to go through in order to get quality care for their families. So the next part, I'm going to just talk a little bit about kind of some of the high-level recommendations that families talked about, things that they really said, this is what we need. If we're really going to have a good early childhood care and education system, these are the things that are most important. Some of them, again, are not going to be anything that you all haven't heard before or anything that we haven't heard from families. Affordability was just huge. You just can't talk to families about childcare without them talking about affordability. And just about how many compromises they're making because they feel like they often can't afford the quality care that they might want. So that came out as just a huge issue. So I hope you have a second just to read the quotes. And from across all of the groups. We're either having to compromise cost of care just to get in someplace while we wait for the place we want, or the places that we're in, there just isn't an option for different childcare. Other options are more unaffordable. Our county is a childcare wasteland. I had to keep him in what was low quality care because it was the only option that she had. Another recommendation just around, and again, nothing new here that we haven't been hearing for really a long time from families, is just this need for an expanded array of choices. Especially infants and families with infants and toddlers. We heard a lot about how difficult it was to find part-time care and how providers just wouldn't even put them on the list unless they wanted full-time care for their infants. But especially also for those of you from rural communities, heard a lot about how really dire it is, and especially for families with infants and toddlers, as well as for culturally responsive, culturally specific care. Heard a lot about the need for more providers of color, folks who look like me, look like my child, providers who speak other languages, and especially, we've heard this before, but again, these families with infants and toddlers talking about how do you leave your nonverbal or pre-verbal infant with a care provider that you can't communicate with in your native tongue, and just how heartbreaking and difficult that was, but that it had to happen. Or we're using my next door neighbor's teenage daughter because at least she speaks Spanish and she's the only one that I can really trust. Things like this. Again, part-time off-hours care, we all know those are difficult, but just really something that's badly needed in the community. Oops. All right. My computer seems to have frozen. There we go. Another thing we heard about is that families really want to be informed consumers of childcare. They want information that can really actually help them make choices about where they might find quality care. But often they found that the information that was given to them was just not very useful. Like one example here, 211 gave me a list of providers to call. I called everyone from those lists and asked if anyone spoke Spanish, but no one did. Yes, it was difficult to find childcare. And then another family in a rural community saying, you know, it would be so great if there were some places where I could go. So there's still this, I don't know where to go for information, but also that a lot of the information that's there, it doesn't give them enough information about quality and about the kinds of things that they might need the kinds of things that they might need to know to make a more informed decision about how to sift through a list of names of providers.
We heard that on the suspension expulsion interviews as well, just for families to know, like, what are your suspension expulsion policies? You know, they'd have one meeting with a provider and they, you know, the provider would say, no, I can't support your child, or, you know, same, having to call through a list of 40 providers to find out none of them had availability, or, you know, only had wait lists.
Yeah. Another thing that we heard was that families really recognize the importance of work to stabilize the workforce. And these families understand that providers, childcare providers, are not really being paid a living wage, and they see that playing out in their relationships with providers. And this came up in the suspension expulsion interviews, I think, in particular, in my mind, that they would just start to work with someone at a particular center, a teacher or a staff person, and that person would be gone. And so how do you develop a relationship with a provider in that situation, especially around a child with special needs? But just really thinking, I'm going to leave my infant, my baby, who can't even tell me if something bad is happening while they're in childcare, and I'm going to leave them with someone that I don't know about the quality of training they have, what level of professionality they're bringing, just how scary that is for families. And for sure, if any of us have had our child in infant care, can share and relate to that.
Yeah, just to tack on really quick, for the suspension expulsion interviews, we heard like it'd be really great if providers were able to be full-time, because, you know, those kiddos built relationships with providers and, you know, they were only a part-time teacher. And so, you know, their ability to really connect and build relationships with those teachers were limited if they're only there for part of the day.
Thank you. Along those lines, families told us they really, really want providers to be getting the training and coaching that they need, again, to build that quality. And I think some of the highest priorities that they had were around inclusive practices, broadly defined, both in terms of inclusion of children with identified special needs, as well as inclusion and welcoming of families without racism or bias showing up in how they were working with families and children. Ability to individualize this, like, my child, you know, doesn't like to have the rain pants or whatever, and being able to be flexible around that and how important that is for children. Social emotional development also came through, this desire, this understanding that providers really do have a significant impact on children's social emotional development, and that seems to be something that providers often don't kind of understand or work towards. And then again, this idea around families recognizing, yeah, you know, we've had some bad experiences with childcare providers. They've been, you know, discriminatory. They've been biased against us for a variety of reasons: economic, single parent, race, ethnicity, linguistic, how they're paying with childcare subsidies, if they're LGBTQIA plus or non-gender conforming. So just really important emphasis on that anti-bias, anti-racist curriculum, and seeing that played out in practice. And just sharing some of these quotes. I do want my son in a daycare center to help me out. The whole reason why I don't want to is the fact that I work in one. Like, how heartrending is that from a Native American participant? A parent who said, even today, my daughter will say, I'm a bad girl. And then when we asked her why, we figured out it was because the care provider would use the words, "You're making a good choice or a bad choice," but the girl was always making a bad choice. So she internalized that as, "I am a bad girl." We heard several stories like that of how providers' language is being internalized in negative ways for young children. And then providers who just don't know what to do. Family asking, at one point I was frustrated. I said, "Is there something you want me to try with him at home? Is there anything I can do? Something I can do?" And they couldn't come up with anything. So just some real needs there. Again, nothing you all aren't aware of, but just really driving home those priorities. Another thing, again, coming back to this issue of bias and discrimination, again, we heard a lot of talk about the importance of having providers who, both in their own appearance and cultural background, reflect the families that are being served, but also throughout in their materials and in the curriculum that they're using, looking for that openness. Encouraging them to display visible signs of inclusive policies and practices, which they really don't see. So they know, for example, that the provider is at least welcoming to them and their family, and how to really get folks to be more inclusive. We heard a lot of stories of non-inclusive practice and language across the groups. We also heard, so especially for infants and toddlers, but really across all of them, that as members of marginalized communities, they often chose to rely on families and friends because they felt like at least they could trust them, right? So I'm not going to trust someone I don't know, but I'll at least use my family and friends, but also acknowledging that often that was a trade-off, that they're hanging out with their sister, their aunt, and they're hanging out like you do at home, but they're not getting the educational and developmental support that they might otherwise want for their child. So expanding training and professional supports to those family, friends, and neighbor caregivers is a really important area for these families. Okay. So that's really high level. Again, I would urge you when the reports come out to look at the reports that go into much more detail about the messages from each of those priority populations. Mackenzie's going to hit a few of those highlights for us before we wrap up.
Yeah, so those were a lot of the things that we heard, across all of the families that we talked to, some similarities. And so, specifically for infants and toddlers, as we've mentioned before, that the lack of the affordable, quality, and culturally responsive care is really taking a toll on family well-being. And I would also add, like, this is something we heard in the suspension expulsion interviews. Like, I had a few parents that were just in tears on the phone, and were so appreciative that we were having these conversations and that their voices were being heard, because it's something that they felt so alone and isolated with, especially, during COVID. And so, for the infants and toddler families, again, iterating that needing care that they can trust, and think specifically, what that looked like was, communicative, professional, that, they encourage parent caregiver visitation, that there's, kind of that open door, and that they are warm and caring to their children, and, are treating their children like they would treat their own children. And I think that, goes back to that home-like environment, with, characterized by also having professional level of quality. Again, that part-time infant care is being important, and regular communication about, how things are doing, pictures, texts, there's so many of those apps that exist now, that families are seeing as important to have that regular communication.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, Mackenzie, along those lines, just the issue of basic health and safety for infants really came through. I think there was a lot of families who shared with us horror stories that they had heard of, things that happened to infants or things that their children had experienced in care, with, not changing diapers or coming in and finding the infant and like all of the infants sitting in like little lockdown chairs, by which I mean like high chairs. But anyway, so just this health and safety concern came through much stronger than I would say other family focus groups that we've done with, say, preschool age children who at least have some verbal ability to talk about what's going on in care. And obviously you can't get that from an infant.
So for LGBTQIA plus parents, again, that complexity and stress for finding care that really is going to be accepting and quality for their family, ensuring that their children are going to be in a setting where they're safe from discrimination, either from the provider, from other children, from other families. So having a provider who's really versed in being able to navigate that space, and interrupt discrimination that's happening, or having the language for, building in time in their curriculum to talk about this. So not only just having the rainbow flag in the window, but how are they interrupting discrimination that's happening in the classroom? So this quote saying, I feel like many LGBTQ people have a lot of difficulties getting caregivers who have proper knowledge of their needs without choice or compromise. And they may just, go for what they can get, which was the theme that I think, again, we heard across families. And then for, specific recommendations, again, having systemic training on creating inclusive environments and what that looks like, what, curriculums can be used, conversations, ways to interrupt discrimination that's happening, specific resources for families of the LGBTQIA plus community to share, their experiences and referral recommendations, and to report irregularities that they're seeing and discrimination that they've experienced. This is something we also heard in the suspension expulsion interviews, is that, having a easier access to reporting providers, and, being able to do that in a way that's gonna be intentional, was important.
We heard that in the infant and toddler groups too, really. They just
Mm-hmm.
don't know what to do if something bad happens. They don't know where to go or who to talk to about it.
And some additional recommendations from families who experience suspension expulsion. So again, providing that training for inclusion and addressing ableist mindsets, providers that are willing and able to provide a safe and inclusive and developmentally appropriate environment, and are able to individualize, and then, commit to partnering with families when children do have additional needs. So for a couple of the families that we heard who had experience in Head Start, they talked about how amazing of an experience it was for those families who, Head Start just didn't really have like the classroom size, or at that time, the teachers that were trained to address their children's needs. And so they really worked with the family to transition them to a different provider with either a smaller classroom size, or a provider that they felt like could really better meet the needs of their child, and help to introduce them and do that full transition. But for all the other families we talked to, they said that the provider didn't really give them any additional support or resources. It was just like, no, we can't support you. And for a lot of families, it felt like if they they're running their daycare or childcare as a business. And so if I can have a family or a child in here who's not causing as many issues and still get paid, then I'm going to ask you to find other care and really not accommodate your child. At least, that was the family's experience. So having more, information and resources for families, and, for a couple of families, they had, gone through the process to get assessed through EIECSE, and, for some of those kiddos, they're, it was more behavioral, or, their behaviors didn't meet the threshold needed to get EIECSE services, but, could have still benefited from those services. So, really thinking about how to potentially expand those requirements or additional funding for EIECSE to be able to serve more kiddos.
Right. So that gets us to the end of our presentation. So I'm just wondering, and I can even stop sharing. We had some discussion questions that we made up. But we weren't sure exactly in the terms of the culture of this group. Do you like to do small groups? Should we break out into some small groups? Should we have some big group discussion? But maybe first, does anybody have any questions or just initial reflections or kind of things that stood out to you in what we shared today? And if you're not comfortable speaking up, you could put it in the chat.
So this is Andy Bales-Molnar at the ELD. Hi. I was wondering in your family interviews if there were ever times when you had a conversation with a family and they were like, we had the perfect experience from beginning to end, and these are all the things that made it feel that way to us, where there's any kind of strengths we can try to scale up in other areas too?
Yeah, I think almost all of the families that we talked to had eventually found a provider that they loved. And so towards the end of the report, for those interviews, we highlight some of the things that they talked about of either the classroom size or, the way that the teacher was able to individualize, or, or it was a mix of, now my kiddo's in a EIECSE classroom during the morning, and then another, childcare provider in the afternoon, that, they have different but both very positive experiences. So yeah, there's definitely in the full report some highlights of what they're liking about their providers that they have been able to find.
And I think that's true across all of the groups as well. I mean, we got some beautiful descriptions of the things that they really liked from some of their providers. And almost all of them went through some fairly stressful process of trying to find that provider and get their child care. So, Renee, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I wouldn't say that all of this was super surprising, but having it kind of all condensed into a report, it felt a little overwhelming for me. Really good information, but I was also just aware of how this would hit the early learning workforce. Our providers have struggled so much over the last couple of years just to keep afloat, stay in business, retain staff. And I just would, I guess, have some concerns about how we share this with our early learning workforce. For system leaders, it makes a lot of sense. I just feel very, I guess, feeling sensitive towards how this would impact providers. So that was my initial hit.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. We are going to have 3 sessions, as I said, that are really open to the community that providers very well might attend. I think in framing up the presentation for today, we did, given this audience, focus on where do the system leaders need to take action? Because as I said, we've heard much of this before. These are real needs. And so how do we elevate that? But your point is well taken in terms of talking broadly to the community. Like the aspects of quality that they talked about often were because of their own experiences and what they liked. That was less true, I think, for the LGBTQIA plus community. I think just that group of folks at first they were like, yeah, they had to think about what would I really like more often, I'd say, than some of the other groups who did end up more or less landing in situations that seem to be working for them. That not all, but many.
Looks like Margie added in the chat, as we're focusing on the regional assessments, how should this input help shape the project at the local level? And I think we could pass that off to somebody at the ELD, most likely, to answer that.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out, Margie, with regional assessments, and as you're gathering partners to come together around regional assessments, I think especially those markers of quality might be something to look at and help inform or develop the questions, and the exploration of root causes that each of your partner groups, your regional assessment groups, might be uncovering.
I think in addition to that, it's how, as Renee was sharing, how do we put it in a supportive, proactive approach so that we don't alienate, but rather we recruit and collaborate to build that, quality system that these parents are looking for. And, these issues are not just rural issues. I find that a little bit unusual. The focus is on the rural communities. These are just as real. And, and I serve in a hub that's got, urban and rural, and, they're everywhere, not just in our rural communities. So
yeah, I
find it a bit
to clarify, we had really broad
geographical rural communities.
Yeah. We had broad representation from rural and urban communities for sure.
But you lead with, prioritize rural, and it's like, that's really unfair to where the lion's share of our population lives then when we do that.
We're trying to express what families shared with us around the rural families were really like so articulate, especially around infant toddler care and the lack thereof. So we're just reflecting that back. I understand that rural versus urban investments is a larger sort of political question to be wrestled with. Yeah.
Well, we're supposed to be data driven. And, the data says the greatest need is where the greatest part of the population is generally. So data suggests a different response. It's not politics, it's data.
Different data set. Different data set. Other questions or reflections?
I think for me, I appreciated that a lot of the things that parents are asking for, I think, is getting to some better articulation of what we in the system sometimes just summarize as professionalizing the field or as professional learning and foundational understanding. But parents have been really able to break down what that means and what it looks, how they see it, like how, like we can say like this is what it looks like in practice, but if that doesn't ring true to families when they're in a classroom and they're like, if somebody is doing what we say this is what it looks like in practice, and if family's saying I don't see it at all, then there's not a match, and we are not in sync with how do we demonstrate and how are we meeting parent needs and to a degree expectation. And I think parents, what I'm hearing is that parents are really expecting the people they take their children to for care to be professionals and to be experts. And that feels like some progress too, in terms of last week alone, I was in several meetings where we talked about society needs to change and society needs to view those in childcare as professionals. And this kind of makes me think, well, it feels like families are already there. So how do we empower families to be the demand and that supply and demand around that? So that feels like it came through in this, what you guys were hearing.
Oh, absolutely.
It's interesting.
Right. I mean, even just the issue around family, friend, and neighbor care, not saying, yeah, I need my aunt to become a licensed childcare provider necessarily, or a, professional teacher in a Head Start classroom, but provide the training so that she understands, if she's taking care of my baby, like what the best practices might be, because she doesn't really know. She's just plopping the kid down in front of TV. Yeah, Karen.
Hi, everybody. Karen Hinkemeyer, pronouns she, her, Director of Family Stability at Community Action. I wanted to my reflections are, one, these are common things that we have heard throughout the years, definitely. But then also really taking a look that, in my opinion, families do not have the support and connection in understanding what the options and different supports that can be provided in the types of care. And with the implementation of Preschool Promise and Head Starts and the possibility of childcare, universal childcare, how do we then support families in making these choices that meet the needs, the special needs that they have? And so I see, and I feel like that is an opportunity for us to step up and support families in a more inclusive and supportive way that goes beyond looking at a database online or getting a list of referrals.
Yeah, and I think just having, oh, sorry to interrupt somebody. For the families that I talk to, even just having a little bit of additional information before, even if it is a database online, like, does this provider even have availability? Do they have an outdoor exercise area that my kid can run around and blow off steam in order for them to, be able to better sit down in a reading circle, or different things like that that could help them initially know whether or not like it's even worth giving them a call.
Yeah, this is Molly in Multnomah. I was thinking about how this research and this just recent conversation underscores our perception of accessing childcare and preschool as a very individual activity, that it's up to an individual contract between the parent and the provider. And that is something in Multnomah, we just keep hitting up against a realization that it doesn't have to be that way, that is a cultural and social assumption that we've built into this business. But even just recently, I was talking with some of our Vietnamese families who are like, yeah, we would never shop for childcare. You go to people that and what you can afford. Like, anyway, it just struck me how different or how big an assumption I have as an older white woman built into my understanding of how childcare is accessed, but it's the way the system is built. And how do you build a system, a real system, if it's all based on individual contracts? It's like, it's almost like there's a fundamental tension or a discrepancy in there that I just can't quite pull out, but this research just totally underscored it's every parent's in there for themselves. They have to be. That's the only way it works.
Yeah.
Just my thought.
And I totally agree with that, Molly. And what we heard, and maybe it's because this, whatever system is operating at the our system, agency system, professional system level around information or support isn't touching these families. They're using their community networks, like you just said. They're going to their neighbors or their friends, people who for referrals or for, who did you go to or who do you trust for childcare? That's where there's like there's some leverage points, it seems like, in terms of thinking differently about how we can get information to families or help them engage in the process of finding quality that might be more beneficial.
And Beth, I don't know if you saw Margie also put into the chat that parent choices are really hard to the first time parent without that local support system. They do not know even what they need to know. It's not an easy way to know because the Spark system hasn't really been shared with families that need to know. So yeah, I think a lot of front end helping people really kind of understand how to enter into the childcare system too. And starting that early. I was having a conversation with friends of ours who are very smart people who work systems way better than I ever do. And they're pregnant with their first child. And I was like, okay, let's just sit you down. Because I asked if they're like, well, at 18 months, we're going to go to this center down the street. I'm like, let's talk about that and how easy it is to work on that and what else is available. So yeah, it's hard to know.
And access points, again, speaking to that, need for more broad community sources, community, what's the word, Molly? Sort of community level responsibility for helping families, as opposed to each family in and of themselves. And like, I'm thinking about the one parent who talked about, it would be great if when I went to the pediatrician where I go, when my baby was born, I went every other week, to be able to go there and get information about childcare, but they don't know where to tell me to go, or they don't know where to tell me to go for information, things like that.
Can we talk about 211? Like effectiveness, ineffectiveness, is this a big piece of the system? Did parents love it? Just asking.
We did have a family mention, calling 211. And so they got a list of like 40 different providers that then they had to call each provider and see if they had availability and see if they would even accept their child. So, yeah.
Well, and the Spanish speaking mom whose quote was in the presentation, who was like, well, none of them spoke Spanish, so that didn't help me. We can't speak broadly to the effectiveness of 211 from this research.
I gotcha. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I guess it just did not come out as, hey, that's a really useful part of the system for the parents that you interviewed.
Right. No, that's fair to say.
I just have to add, it's not like renting a car where you can go online and say, I need it for this date to this date, right? There's so much more involved in giving your child over to somebody else. And so online is, yes, a choice for families, and it is good to have that, but there's more that we need to do to help families through the process and understand the process.
I'm just going to second what Karen was mentioning about that parent education piece about what are we really communicating enough to the systems that we're funding through the state to communicate about what really drilling down to some of those specifics about what is available for families, when they're, coming into our preschool promise programs and they're putting that in there and we're saying we want you to make parent choice. Are we communicating to them all the different options, especially when we have families that have really big needs or very differing situations? I think that's where we really have a responsibility to drill down and communicate what's available in our community at the different levels. What are the different resources available here that may not be as available in some of our other situations? And I think that's just it, is that we all know And this is the hardest probably part to swallow sometimes, is that we know parents make decisions based on what they can afford, or some of those things that are very more practical, I guess, than best practice sometimes. And so, what can we do in the systems that we do have to communicate what all those different options are in our community, so that parents really can make the best practice? Just because they put in an application with our preschool promise sites, those still not in every situation might be the best place for them. So how are we communicating about our relief nurseries in different places? So that's what it makes me reflect on.
Yeah, we had one parent who has multiple kiddos and was talking about, their experience with their first kiddo and just feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm a bad parent. Like, I don't know like what to do if my kiddo is having these behaviors and like is getting kicked out of, a program. And then, was reflecting on her experience with her second kiddo, and just was like, I knew all of the questions I needed to answer. I, ask, I knew like what to look for. I knew, how to navigate that system in such a different way than that first time around.
That feeling of, like, I was just really struck with the internalization of shame from that child. And then I think I hear that too with what you're saying about the parent. And it makes me wonder, when we're looking at a family-centered system, what families think high quality is, and we have a system that tells them what high quality is, are we creating shame, or shaming families unintentionally or not for either taking what's available or trusting in what they know and what they choose? It just kind of makes me think about the ways that the scarcity and our ways of sharing information or defining maybe unintentionally just bringing up a lot of shame around choices and what our system can or cannot do to support them.
So here's a crazy idea I just throw it out there for consideration. What if we let the parents choose that family friend or neighbor, then allowed a system that would allow a background check of that person, so we know that there's not any obvious safety issues there. Do a check of the environment to make sure there's not any structural safety issues there, and then build a system that then is going to give that caregiver kind of step 1, step 2, step 3 ways in which to work their way to being a more adequate caregiver. So they're not just plunking the child in front of the TV. If that's where we know that many of our families, for a variety of reasons, turn, and I would admit, I was one of those parents who chose to go with the trusted neighbor across the street. Because I knew that person. So, just if we were truly going to be a consumer-driven system, right now we're more of a provider-driven system. And that's not even working for us because we can't find enough people willing to accept the working conditions to do that. So just my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation, Margie. And how can you resource the system that families are already using, as opposed to resourcing the system that's completely overburdened and maybe they're not accessing or not as happy with.
But just wondering if it's okay to share a PDF of our slides that we went over today, or if we'd want to.
I don't see why not, although with the report not released, I'm wondering if we should check with Jenny. Andy, what do you think?
I think it's better to check with her first, just in case. And then we can, if for some reason they would prefer, we can just make sure we send it out to everybody as soon as the report's released.
Yeah, and I don't anticipate a big delay. I
think
know
so.
that she's working with the comms team at the ELD for release. I'm hoping next week. So, and then at that point, we definitely can share the presentation as well as the reports with you all, which will be available, by the way. We'll have the executive summary in English, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, and Vietnamese. And then the full reports for each group in English and Spanish.
But, and, you know, as a person who's working on the regional assessment, if it would at all be possible to kind of share this in terms of how we might use this as questions as we reach out to our various stakeholder communities to do that regional assessment. And then even if you have some suggestions on how to operationalize some of what these parents were really expressing heartfelt need for. So, you know, it would be a shame to me to have this information that's come from all these families to then get parked on a shelf, and then we all go off and do separate research that may be redundant or may contradict. So
Yeah, I'm right with you, Margie. I don't want this to sit on a shelf either. I'm curious. I'd love to hear some ideas for, like, if we were to send these out, like what would be helpful next steps around how to use the information or how to use it as a basis or a jumping off point for you all in your own local data collection. In fact, we have another scheduled meeting to come and talk about Elmo, but I'd love to talk more about, like, what are your TA needs around how to use this resource. We also have a provider survey data that's going to come out very soon for you. So we have things that are coming that aren't county specific or hub specific, but might be very useful for you all as you're working on those needs assess or those systems analyses.
I see Kelly Poe's hand up.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Kelly, go ahead. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, thank you very much. I just wanted to thank you so much for this conversation and the presentation and doing the work with the parents. I know that you're in my hub region, and I really appreciate that. And I appreciate how difficult this work has been. And I just really want to take an opportunity to thank this group, both the hubs and the CCRNRs, for taking this kind of information and putting it into positive, proactive strategies. And I really think that that's the work of this group. The last several minutes or quite a bit has been swirling in a lot of negativity, and I just don't want to end this meeting this way. You've done so much good work, and it's going to lead us into making some really positive changes. And I don't want to discount the thousands of children we have successfully served, and acknowledge that we're not done. We're so far ahead of where we were 20 years ago. It's just mind-boggling to me to see how families are accessing supports in their communities different than they did even 5 and 10 years ago. But the world for early childhood is completely different than it was 20 years ago in Oregon. And it's because of the system work that we're doing here. And we have to keep going back and asking the people that we serve if we got it right. And we'll never get it right. We can always make improvements, but don't get stuck. I can't personally get stuck in what's wrong. I need to put something forward that's going to motivate me to improve. And meeting with parents, even when they tell me what's not working, gives me positive energy to do more and to move forward. So again, I just thank you for this group. I thank you for the having this conversation under the lens of equity and how we can do more and meet parents where they are. And got to put a positive spin on this conversation in my head so I can go to my next meeting.
Thank you, Kelly. I also wanted to mention Karen Prow had a question in the chat. Oh, and Mackenzie has answered the question. So I have done my duty and described what is happening in the chat. Thanks, Mackenzie.
And just to build on that a little bit, Kelly, I know that, yeah, I said the stories, there were lots of heartbreaking stories, which was very true. And as Mackenzie shared, families, they want to be heard and they appreciated being able to tell their stories of success and challenge. And they're frustrated, they're stressed, they're overwhelmed, they want things to change and get better in some pretty dramatic ways that I know that's the rub, right? That's the thing. If we could all wave a magic wand and have every child get access to free childcare, I think we'd all do it. But really just being like, as researchers, we get tired of going to families and hearing them tell us the same things over and over and over and over and feeling like, where is the system changing? So I appreciate you like reminding us that the system has changed and there's ways to go.
And I also think I think all that's true. The system has changed, but we're reintroducing the system to parents. Those who are coming in and looking for childcare for their infant toddlers were perhaps not in the system 20 years ago. So it's also hard for them to see the improvements and the changes and really some of those strengths because this is their first time encountering it. And so it can be hard for us because we're like, oh, still so much work to do and we've done so much. But for me, I think that's a good reminder sometimes is that they're being introduced to it possibly for the very first time. And whether it's because it's their first child or their first child in Oregon or their first child in the United States or their first experience as a foster parent or a grandparent who now has custody. So sometimes it's just, I think for me, good to sit back and remember this is their first time into it and there's probably a lot of surprises too.
There really probably is some important need for really highlighting this profession and the power of it and the value of it through their own voices. I think we quickly see things that have gone wrong and get broadcast everywhere and all that kind of thing. So there tends to be a focus on what's going wrong as opposed to the value and importance. I know that's something we're looking at in our county through our Douglas County Coalition. How can we communicate and highlight and uplift this profession and the work and the importance of it? How do we educate our communities about it? Because we want more people to get into it.
Well, I don't think we have anything else for you all today. I really I'm very, as I said, I was happy to be able to come today and share some of this, and I'll look forward to, if you do have ideas for how we might support use of any of the reports that are coming out of the PDG work that are going to be coming out over the next month or so for your EXA work. We'd love to hear it. So feel free to email us, reach out with ideas, or the next time you see us on one of your calls, which I'm pretty sure you're going to for the next, a number of calls actually, there'll be somebody from PDG. Feel free to share those ideas with us because yeah, we don't want this to sit. We want the voices that we listen to be heard by the folks that can make a difference. So thank you for listening to us today.
Yeah, and I added my email to the chat in case anybody wants to or needs to reach out via email with questions or follow-ups. And yeah, I appreciate everybody's feedback and reflections and engagement around this information.
I want to just wrap up just for a minute. I just want to say thank you so much to our research team for doing all of this hard work and listening to those stories that aren't always easy to hear, and putting them into a report that is going to hopefully inform the work that the awesome work that hubs and CCRNRs are already doing, and continue to move that forward. This is the first time I've been in a hub and CCRNR meeting together, and I just have to say that I love the energy. I love the dedication to this work that you are all showing. I feel really excited and privileged to be a part of this. And so next steps, the research team gets the okay to share those PDFs of the slides and we get the reports, we will get those sent out to you, and we will make sure that we have time together, either with hubs and CCRNRs together or separately, to have more discussions around this so we can incorporate this into our future work. So thank you everyone for coming to the meeting. We really appreciate your time and energy, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you again for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.